Welcome everybody to this event on climate emergency, where we will study how the 2025 Inter-American Court of Human Rights Advisory Opinion resets states' obligations related to the environment. Today's event is hosted by three interest groups of the American Society of International Law, the Human Rights, the International Environmental Law, and the Latin American Interest Group. Today, we will focus on the Inter-American Court, but I invite everybody to listen this week's ACIL podcast from the series International Law Behind the Headlines, where Professor Payama Kaban guides us through the advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice. This has been an exceptional year where three international courts have issued advisory opinions: the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal of the Law of the Seas, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Today's event brings together three renowned experts, including an Inter-American judge, a special UN rapporteur, and an expert on strategic litigation. Our three panelists will unpack the Inter-American Court's holdings. They will help us understand the use cogens obligations related to the environment, the Declaration of the Rights of Nature, environmental due diligence, protection of vulnerable groups, and identify practical pathways for the implementation across international human rights mechanisms and local jurisdictions. Our speakers have impressive careers, and I will limit the introduction to their current positions. Veronica Gomez is a judge of the Inter-American Courts of Human Rights. Elisa Morguera is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights. And Viviana Kritisevich is the Executive Director of CEHIL, and she's an active participant in the advisory opinion procedure. We will divide the discussion in two parts. If time permits, we will answer the questions from the public or make final remarks. We will give each speaker 7 minutes. So let's start with this first block. Elisa, can you guide us through the importance of this advisory opinion and its relationship to the other two global advisory opinions? Thank you very much. Elisa?
Yeah, thank you so much, Francisco. It's such an honor to be in this distinguished panel. So first, maybe I will start just by saying how complementary the three advisory opinions are. First of all, in recognizing the urgency and universal nature of the climate crisis. Of course, the Inter-American Court had a question framed in those terms and provided specific clarifications about the rationale for recognizing a climate emergency. But I think all advisory opinions were coherent in that understanding of the historical and universal and existential challenge that was brought before them. The third aspect that I think is complementary among the three advisory opinions is also that recognition of the climate and climate change as part of a broader understanding of the interconnected life-supporting systems of our planet. Again, I think the Inter-American Court opinion was much more detailed, and I think in some ways very also illustrative of that deep understanding of our climate systems with our natural systems of climate regulation, but also supporting all life on this planet. And that led each and every of the three courts to recognize the importance of ecosystem protection and ecosystem restoration. ITLOS was very explicit in also recognizing how that emphasis allows us to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think the other two courts also related to this idea of ecosystem protection and restoration as a form of effective remedy. All three advisory opinions stressed the stringent due diligence nature of the obligations that were clarified by the courts, and did so on the basis of a holistic, mutually supportive reading of multiple areas of international law. And finally, all three courts, although with significant difference in terms of extent and depth, have recognized the relevance of their findings for the protection of human rights. Of course, the Inter-American Court has been the most detailed and comprehensive in its understanding of both the relevance of this question, the questions that were posed to it for the effective protection of human rights, but equally the very detailed understanding of state obligations, both about what to achieve and prioritize in terms of climate action, but also how to go about it. And I think this is a distinctive contribution that allows also to understand how the other two advisory opinions should be implemented. In particular, I think the attention of the Inter-American Court to intersectionality, to the whole range of human rights holders that experience climate change impacts in differentiated ways because of multiple grounds of vulnerability and discrimination that they may experience, and therefore the obligation for states to adopt differentiated measures that fully respond and take into account that intersectionality is particularly important and has drawn on a significant body also of guidance and evidence that a variety of UN human rights experts and treaty bodies, and also the Office of the Human Rights, had provided over time. In addition, the Inter-American Court also went into, I think, significant length in terms of understanding the deep roots of climate change and how important it is to address those deep root causes from an international human rights law perspective, therefore looking at the need to develop alternative development models, addressing inequalities, including not only in as part of climate action, but included in the choice of climate response measures, and very much recognizing how certain climate response measures, and including the current rush to critical minerals, may actually deepen inequalities and through that either miss or entrench the root causes of climate change, despite the fact that they may be labeled and potentially understood to some extent as climate solutions. The other aspect that I think the Inter-American Court makes a significant distinctive contribution, which I think is relevant for the implementation of the other advisory opinions, is the attention to the protection of democracy, the importance of procedural rights, of access to information, public participation in decision-making and access to remedies, the fundamental need to protect environmental human rights defenders, and again, doing so from an intersectional perspective. And in that context, also emphasizing the role of the human right to science, which I think adds important dimensions to the recognition of all three courts around the obligations of states to take measures on climate change and understand their obligations across the body of international law in relation to climate change on the basis of best available science. Within that context, the Inter-American Court also specifically referred to indigenous knowledge and other knowledge systems. And I think it cannot be overstated how important the proceedings before the Inter-American Court, their unique inclusiveness in terms of diversity of voices, and particularly inclusion of indigenous peoples representatives, Afro-descendants, and also children and young people was. And I think that really sets a precedent that should be an example for all other international, regional, and national proceedings on climate change. Finally, of course, the court has also paid attention to specific areas where we require particular attention to human rights obligations and prioritizing action in relation to fossil fuels, agriculture, and deforestation, very much thinking at the obligation which all three advisory opinions clarified in terms of regulation of business and monitoring of business enterprises, but again, with a deeper layer of understanding around the work that has already been done in relation to business responsibility to respect human rights. And the final point I want to make is that as Special Rapporteur, together with my colleague, Special Rapporteur on the Human Right to a Healthy Environment, Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, we have issued a statement not only to welcome the Inter-American Court advisory opinion, but also recognizing its global relevance, partly because it is responding to the lived experiences of human rights holders most affected by climate change in all regions, partly because it is so extensively based on UN human rights bodies and experts' advice and recommendations, and partly also because it is so clearly aligned in the overall understanding of all the bodies of international law being interpreted in holistic, effective ways that are aligned with the best science available.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Now let's go with Viviana Kristisevich. Viviana, you were very active before the advisory opinion was even presented to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Can you explain to us how is the process before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights? This advisory opinion had more than 200 participants. From government, civil society, academia, vulnerable groups. Please explain to us what is the relevance of this participation and how this influenced the court. Thank you, Viviana.
Thank you very much, Francisco, and thanks to ACIL for convening this very timely roundtable to discuss the Inter-American Court's advisory opinion. It is truly an exciting time to be discussing this intersection of international law and human rights and the climate emergency, not only given the urgency of the climate crisis, but also the momentum of international law in the search for paths forward, as it was very well described by Special Rapporteur Morguera. These three advisory opinions, the litigation, the standards set by Elisa's mandate, and others show how international law can enrich some of those conversations and action points that are necessary to respond to the climate crisis. It is a time when international law can help shed light on the different dimensions of the impact of the climate crisis through a human rights lens, through an international law lens, but it can also show how international law can be an instrument, a tool that is very important in finding solutions that are more equitable, just, sustainable. So it's not only about looking at the crisis as a problem and understanding the implications in human rights, but also how human rights and international law can be part of the solution. And human rights and international law do not work by themselves. We see international law as being a critical tool for mobilizing people, for encouraging and obliging different types of regulations and accountability. And this advisory opinion was envisioned by a group of activists and experts who were thinking about how to use international law for responding more effectively to the climate emergency in the Americas. And we saw an advisory opinion process not only as a tool that could give us a set of results and standards that were very important, but also as a path for creating conversations and knowledge that is necessary to actually address the climate emergency. Not all the solutions are out there. There's much more of a need for intra and interdisciplinary conversations and knowledge creation. There's a need to take into account the situated realities of different communities and the knowledge of judges, city officials, human rights defenders, indigenous peoples in developing that. So this is just to say that when thinking about the process of developing and requesting an advisory opinion, it was very much in the heart of the initiative that the process would be as important as the result, that the results were critical, but having a robust discussion was also very important for the community, for the court, for learning, for disseminating knowledge, but also for creating a different type of framework. And the court did that and more. Really, the court went out of its way to convene meetings in key countries, in a Caribbean island state, in a center of institutional power, and in the middle of the Amazon, the Bahamas, no, I'm sorry, in Barbados, in Brasilia, and in Manaus. And the court counted with over 250 briefs that captured contributions of over 600 institutions and entities, persons, organizations, from state officials, indigenous peoples, experts, academics, tribunals, cities, international organizations, businesses, and the court asked difficult questions. I loved seeing the court discussing different aspects of the advisory opinion. It was not one of those situations where you see, I don't know, a court passively absorbing information and nodding. It was incisive questions. It challenged those that presented to the court. It really went to trying to understand the implications of the discussions. It was a really interesting process. And furthermore, many NGOs and academics and others really created their own ripples of discussion. I can say for ourselves, we conducted a consultation of over 1,000 children with the assistance of Guardianes por la Vida and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Colombia. We created study groups based on the different questions that the states had finally asked the court, and tried to work with indigenous peoples. And I've seen many wonderful organizations doing similar things. So 600 contributors is really a very conservative number. I think it was like thousands of people really engaged in this broad dialogue. And I think that as part of that, the result of that, we have a court decision and an advisory opinion that is truly very rich. It includes a lot of the situated knowledge, as well as the academic knowledge, as well as the perspective of states in key areas. It provides us with the science and with further developments on procedural pillars, but also on substantive rights and obligations of cooperation, on issues of equality and non-discrimination, a roadmap for human rights defenders, and much more. So yes, I think that idea that the process would be as important as the result was actually true, and we hope that robust level of conversations and knowledge creation and alliances continues for what comes next.
Thank you very much, Viviana. And now that you have explained to us how the process from civil society, states, and academia was taken care of, I would like to talk to Judge Gomez about what were the challenges to put all this information together. How did you deal from the court's perspective with the new subjects of rights, the nature? And what, in your opinion, what are the major contributions of the court? In our second block, we will talk about more specific intersectional approaches, vulnerable groups, women, children. But can you guide us, Judge Gomez, on the challenges that the Inter-American Court faced in this advisory opinion?
Thank you very much, Francisco. Thank you for your moderation. Thanks to Asil for this opportunity. Yes, I just want to put it in 5 points that it's, I think, summarize a little bit some of the challenges that we had to confront when addressing such an important topic. The first one is what sort of pedagogy we were going to offer through the advisory opinion. And you can see that the court makes an effort, I don't know how successful it is, but to explain why there is a climate emergency. This was important to the court, wondering whether it should do it or not. But in the end, it tried to do it because there is a pedagogical aspect to an advisory opinion. So the first point of the pedagogy was trying to explain why there was a climate emergency. Addressing climate science in a way that highlights the work of the panel and at the same time explains all these foundations for why we have these findings, these scientific findings in common to guide us. Then I think that there is an important contribution in terms of right to science and a definition of best available science, and also try to explain the relationship between environmental law, international law, and human rights law. There is an effort. That was a challenge. It is a challenge for any international court that tries to decide on these issues and to make an interpretation that would be useful at the domestic and the international level. The second point is the issue of the recognition of the right to a healthy climate and the due diligence standards. The opinion establishes that the climate system is distinguished from other environmental components that have already been recognized as healthy environment, as a human right. And it indicates that this is a system that deserves protection from dangerous anthropogenic interference. And from there, the court moves to the standards on due diligence, which provides some sort of mapping of what, in terms of what is required to confront the climate crisis, including identification, detailed and in-depth assessment of risks, adoption of proactive and ambitious preventive measures, using, again, the best available science in the design and implementation of climate action, the integration of a human rights perspective into the monitoring policies, the permanent and adequate monitoring of the effects and impact of the adaptation measures, the strict compliance with the obligations arising from procedural rights, in particular access to information, participation, and access to justice, the transparency and accountability in connection with climate action, the appropriate regulation and supervision of corporate due diligence. There is a lot of focus on business and human rights in this advisory opinion, and the enhanced international cooperation in areas such as technology transfer and sharing, financing, and capacity building. There's a mapping there, and many pages, many paragraphs on very technical areas of law and public policy. And I want to highlight as a third element this issue of the obligation of cooperation. It came out of an amicus curiae presented by a group of European professors, and it was clear to the court that we were in front of a very, very important element, that states had an obligation to cooperate in good faith to make progress towards the respect and guarantee of the human rights threatened by the climate emergency, and that there had to be a recognition of differentiated responsibilities in connection to the causes of climate change, respective capabilities, especially in the area of economic and technical matters and specific needs. And this obligation of cooperation had to be interpreted in light of the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. And that meant not only offering cooperation, but also accepting cooperations, so that we could have a comprehensive response to the multiple causes and effects of the climate emergency. So I think that's an important aspect of the advisory opinion. As a fourth point, it's been mentioned already, science as a common ground, the definition of best available science, and the inclusion also of local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge that has been tested through time, and the connection with the mainstream science. I think the advisory opinion addresses that issue in a way that is complementary to other advancements in international law. I just want to take one more minute to talk about access to information and dealing with misinformation or disinformation. The advisory opinion establishes that effective access to climate-related information is an essential condition for the protection of the right to life, the right to physical integrity, the right to health, the right to the environment, a healthy environment, and a healthy climate. And access to this type of information enables social oversight and in turn fosters transparency and promotes accountability in public administration. In the context of the climate emergency, this also enables the activation of protection mechanisms against natural disasters and is essential for defining mitigation and adaptation goals, plans, and strategies, and also for the adoption of remedial measures. And the advisory opinion addresses three aspects in this respect: the obligation to produce information, the obligation to disclose and facilitate access to information, and the obligation to take measures against disinformation. And there's all sorts of recommendations in this regard that also reach the private sector. But just the last thing regarding the obligation to take measures against disinformation that provoke misperceptions on scientific consensus on climate change, the advisory opinion indicates that states must implement information strategies that do not compromise pluralism and freedom of expression in the public debate, but that the information emanating from public officials on the climate emergency must be clear, must be truthful, accessible, and timely, so that citizens can exercise democratic control over its content, and so that states can be channels of information backed by science. And they must refrain from disseminating information that is not supported by the best available science or by relevant local, traditional, or indigenous knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Gomez. And there are some questions on the Q&A section. If you can take a look at these, at them. Professor Dinah Shelton is watching us, and she has a question on use cogens. So who would like to take that question from Professor Shelton? We have also people that are watching us from Greece, from Berlin, from the United States. Judge Gomez, let me start with Viviana so that you have time to recap your ideas. And you have both talked about the procedure, how it came to the court, this advisory opinion, all the challenges that you faced. But there is a question also in the chat about the repercussions of battling for climate change in practice. So let's go to the area of implementation, Viviana. What are the challenges that we have? Are states really listening to this advisory opinion? What can the court do next? What can civil society do in order to have an effective implementation, as Judge Cansado Trindade expressed, the effect utile of the human rights? Well, Viviana, guide us through the implementation of this advisory opinion.
Okay. Well, I think it will take us all to implement and this advisory opinion. I think one of the major challenges that we have is that we are not in a situation where states and businesses and large swathes of key actors are eager to go in the route that is identified by the three advisory opinions and a set of cases, because there's still an appetite for fossil fuels and really a lot of difficulties in the implementation of just transitions. There's a rampant level of violence and impunity against environmental human rights defenders of all kinds. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation and on this issue and other issues, and there is an eroding of democratic checks and balances at different levels, domestically and internationally. So we're not in the best of situations, but we never are. And I lived under a military dictatorships and as Veronica. So we know that sometimes, you have to do things to make sure that you protect rights and that you walk the right path, even in adverse situations. But I do believe that there is, at some level, by many stakeholders, a realization that we have to do something. And how desperate has the world have to be to reach out to lawyers? We are not generally the first group of people that people have faith on. Scientists are even putting some faith in the law, and it's because we do need to reach to the different tools that we have in the toolbox, all of them, because of the dire situation in which we are, because of the potentials of going through some of the thresholds. So the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court gave us a 20,000 foot view of what we have to do and what are some of the obligations. It gives us also, a guiding star of where we have to go and some practical consequences for businesses, for policymakers, for legislators, for judges and human rights defenders. But now the work that we need to do is to make it much more concrete. On active transparency, as Judge Gomez was saying, the court talks about the importance of producing in a timely manner the type of information that we need to face the climate emergency, and it gives some level of detail, but each country and regionally and probably globally, we will have to go much further in creating a green taxonomy of indicators and areas that are indispensable in order to respond to the climate emergency. And it's not only about disseminating knowledge, it's about creating knowledge and localizing knowledge as well. So that's going back to what I said before. I think that the path for meeting of minds, not only exchanging knowledge, but creating knowledge together is critical. And that still has to be done. Now, I am a litigant and a strategist at heart, and so I have a few things that to share on dissemination. One is we need to continue from different spaces to disseminate and create knowledge and tools. We're doing it at Sahil. You can see it in our webpage. We're doing analytical summaries and guidance tools on specific topics, and encouraging symposiums to open up the discussions and create levels of cross-fertilization. And I know that many others, universities and organizations, and even ASO, we're all trying to do this, and this is a critical part. But I think we also have to see how we prioritize some of the actors that will have more of the levers for speeding up the level of changes that we need at this point. So I think that some of those actors that are critical are constitutional courts and prosecutors, national human rights institutions, and civil society organizations, which are really generally very, very active in doing accountability and naming and shaming, but also proposals for change. I think cities are critical. I think cities and urban settings are sometimes overlooked by international law and international actors, but they can have an incredible impact in methane reduction, for example, which is a critical part of mitigating harm, but also they can have an important role in adaptation and reducing harms. I think journalists are critical for disinformation as well. So beyond the actors, I think there's a group of topics that we need to focus on in our advocacy and the development of litigation and thinking around them. I think that thinking about emissions and probably Elisa has thought much more than all of us together about these issues, but thinking about methane and different types of emissions that allow you to link health and life impacts in a very direct manner, like air pollution, with communities is a great way of fostering the reduction of emissions. Thinking about deforestation and working on issues of deforestation, creating guidance for further guidance and localization on access to information is critical. Working on human rights defenders and linking the standards of the Inter-American Court in this advisory opinion with the action plans under ESCASU, for example, that are being developed right now is a critical part. And finally, I think because we are international lawyers, after all, I think international law cases and negotiations have to be a focus of this community of practice. We have to think what the advisory opinions give us in terms of guardrails for determining the new NDCs for COP30. We have to think about the consequences of these advisory opinions for potential international litigation and interim measures in different fora, and for domestic or regional litigation using or buttressing that litigation with international standards that were developed by these different courts, but in our region specifically by the Inter-American Court. So that's a little bit of food for thought for all of us.
Thank you very much, Vivian. And now I will go with Elisa. You're in Geneva. You work for the United Nations. Can you help us understand how the United Nations mechanisms are going to incorporate these advisory opinions? How are they useful, and how are you going to promote this work?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll use maybe 5 minutes for that and 2 minutes for the important question that Professor Dinah Shelton posed to us in the chat. So as UN Special Procedures on Human Rights, a few mandates already, including mine and that on the human right to a healthy environment, have already incorporated findings from the advisory opinion in our thematic reports. That was true for the ITLOS advisory opinion last year and is already true for the Inter-American Court advisory opinion. For instance, in my most recent report to the UN General Assembly on a human rights-based approach to renewable energy and critical minerals. In doing so, we complement or maybe expand that full understanding of what the international obligations of states are in the light of further evidence from lived experiences, but also understanding of challenges that states are facing in those areas. Equally, I received an extraordinary amount of submissions, over 140, for the preparation of this report on renewables and critical minerals. And so also very detailed understanding of the responsibilities of business, different business sectors, but also really thinking about the role of business as innovators as opposed to key parties in information processes, impact assessment processes, as well as, of course, conducting operations on the ground, consulting with human rights holders, and also exercising influence through their business partnership and across value chains. Critically, what we're doing also in our thematic reports is clarifying the responsibility of funders, public and private, and I think that is such an important piece to ensure effective implementation of all advisory opinions. And in my case, and all special procedures being independent, we are also able to comment and provide recommendations to the UN system as a whole, to specific UN agencies and other international organizations. And I think it's crucial for that responsibility of all UN organs and bodies under the UN Charter to contribute to the protection of human rights, to really embody and embed those clarifications from the advisory opinion in their cooperation work, in their normative advisory work, as well as in their role as secretariats of critical intergovernmental negotiations. And finally, really thinking about institutional and legal reforms at all levels, including reforms of areas of international law, such as international investment law, which was also an area that the Inter-American Court addressed, reforms of institutions as well. So really trying to explore the full range of actors, processes, and areas in which those clarifications of international obligations need to be taken into account. In addition, we've seen some attempts to contribute with our earlier thematic reports to some of the ongoing advisory proceedings. I'm very honored that the Inter-American Court has relied extensively on my report on access to information, and I'm very happy that I was able to make that timely contribution. And now moving forward, I think there's many other roles that as special rapporteurs and other Geneva bodies and experts can, of course, play in terms of advising states on their negotiating positions on climate change, on biodiversity, on plastics, on deep seabed mining, also on the implementation of the BB&J agreement, for instance. All these are crucial areas of international cooperation and continuous international lawmaking where we can advance meaningful climate action and meaningful protection of human rights. But it might not be immediately obvious where the entry points and what kind of repeated negotiating positions are no longer tenable in the light of those advisory opinions. And so this is what we're trying to do in a responsive way, but also in a proactive way. Proactively, we are releasing press releases or statements in advance of key negotiations. For instance, now I'm about to prepare a letter to the Loss and Damage Advisory Board, who is about to meet and develop or finalize criteria for funding and also a call for projects and proposals. And it'll be essential to really relate to the holistic understanding of international law and state obligations and duty of international cooperation in that context. I think ultimately this role is really to ensure that coherence for all states in prioritizing the most meaningful, scientifically backed climate action that best protects everyone's human rights, integrating the understanding of priorities and modalities in climate finance, in technology co-development. And I really want to echo Viviana's arguments about the importance of co-developing knowledge and co-developing climate solutions with human rights holders, and particularly those most affected by climate change and those who have been affected by climate solution, by transition processes that have not been thinking through the nexus of nature, climate, health, food, and water, and have not really taken on board how the lived experiences of those whose rights have been violated provide the most meaningful system thinking about how the systems we need to change as decision makers at every level to fully implement those advisory opinions. And now briefly on the finding of the court on use cogens. I find the succinct reasoning based on the principle of effectiveness persuasive. And I find that it is a reflection and maybe a logical progression from the understanding of how international human rights law has progressively clarified impacts on human rights and obligations of states deriving from climate change, and in fact from inaction or insufficient action by states in mitigating and adapting to climate change. And that evolution of international human rights law at the UN level derives from, again, lived experiences and normative understanding of how the whole structure of international human rights law, even in areas that we didn't imagine would be negatively impacted by climate change, such as modern slavery, human trafficking, violence, structural violence against children, girls and women and others, reflects very much the idea that the climate crisis and the planetary crisis undermine the whole project and every single objective of international law. And I also find it is very important from a pragmatic perspective, and it was a bold stance by the Inter-American Court, because we all know that we are witnessing day in, day out, the same debates we've seen for over 20 or 30 years that are based on inaccurate, I think, characterization of the choice between environmental action, meaningful climate action, to the expense of development, to the expense of economic, social, and cultural rights. And that, unfortunately, embedded with like short-termism and other challenges in our decision-making processes, means that we see the environment always deprioritized, misunderstood, and that intrinsic interdependencies between human well-being and planetary well-being relegated to a secondary role. So I think that the use cogens clarifications is very powerful, is credibly argued, and it's really essential.
Thank you very much, Elisa. So now we go with Judge Gomez. As I mentioned before, the advisory opinion has a particular approach with some groups, indigenous peoples, children, women. Can you comment on this? What are the advancements that this advisory opinion has made? And also the second question from Professor Shelton was not addressed, is the reference to the rights of nature. Judge Gomez.
Thank you, Francisco. In connection to the questions, first I want to say that Professor Dinah Shelton, I mean, we felt very honored. She came to the hearings that took place in Barbados. And she, you know, she made a presentation before the Inter-American Court, and the court asked questions precisely about use cogens. So it's very interesting to meet her again in this occasion with this question. I think there's been an answer in connection with use cogens, and I've been asked about nature. I want to say about both, because these are very much talked about aspects of the advisory opinion. They're not really aspects that the court was asked about by Chile and Colombia. So from my perspective as judge, for me, there are obiter dictums are there, but my colleagues, probably the ones that were in disagreement with those aspects, insisted that they were in the resolutory part of the advisory opinion. But I think they shouldn't have been there. I think they're important elements, but those were not questions that the court was asked But there were issues that it was worth addressing. I felt personally that it was important that the court addressed the issue of how the recognition of the legal personality of nature at the domestic level strengthened the protection of the ecosystem. The court is not saying in advisory opinion that nature has rights, let's say. What it's saying is there is a body of domestic law in different countries, in different jurisdictions, at the level of national constitutions, at the level of municipal legislation of cities, that provide this kind of recognition. And you have it in Latin America, you have it in many countries, you have it in the US, you have it in different parts of the world. It's very difficult to ignore. This is very difficult to ignore by an international court, that domestic law is recognizing this sort of legal personality. And what the court says is that this sort of recognition is relevant and it's important, and it reinforces the protection of the ecosystem, and that is very relevant to human rights that do not take place in a vacuum. They take place, the environment in which people live. This is part of the elements that need to be taken into account at the moment of interpreting state obligations. And domestic law is an important guidance in this regard. I can talk about use cogens if you ask me, Francisco. I think you didn't, but if you ask me, I will. But in connection with the other topic, the issue of the intersectional approach, the advisory opinion addresses the impact of the climate emergency on people's lives through three main dimensions: an intergenerational dimension, an anthropological and cultural dimension, and a socioeconomic dimension. The intergenerational perspective allows for an assessment of the impacts of the climate emergency throughout people's lives and the interests at stake in decision-making, promoting and designing migration and adaptation measures that affect or transform the exercise of individual rights towards the end of a life constitutes a challenge and entails a different responsibility than doing so at an early age and with the certainty of a widespread and long-term impact. Is not the same to suffer the effects of the climate crisis when you're at the end of your life than when you're at the beginning of your life. And there are many, many issues here to explore. The anthropological and cultural perspective allows for an assessment of the differentiated way in which the climate emergency affects the ancestral way of life of indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities living in the Americas across a wide variety of ecosystems and climates. And finally, the socioeconomic dimension reveals the extreme impact of the climate emergency caused by lack of resources, often associated with limited access to housing in areas highly vulnerable to extreme climate events, a shortage of drinking water and sanitation, and a lack of infrastructure for mitigation and adaptation measures vis-a-vis the climate emergency. These three dimensions intersect particularly in young population sectors living in vulnerable geographic areas. And this intersectionality also leads to, we must focus also on women and girls, and as historical, they're historically responsible for caregiving tasks that require access to water, to adequate sanitation, that are essential for the nutrition and the health of families and communities. And I think at this point, advisory opinion number 32 connects with advisory opinion number 31 on the right to provide care, receive care, and to self-care, which is a sister advisory opinion issued by the Inter-American Court only a few days later in in August of this year, and that I think is a very, very important contribution of the Inter-American Court on this topic. And I think that among the rights reference in advisory opinion number 31 on the right to care is the right to a healthy environment. And it refers to concepts like Ubuntu, from Africa, now that we have also the African Court starting its own process on an advisory opinion on climate change, and its foundations in community care. In this advisory opinion, that was also nurtured by Amiti Courier from indigenous populations that asked the court to address the issue of care with care in the sense of community care and care of the environment. This advisory opinion declares the existence of care organization models based on traditional, local, and indigenous knowledge that reflect the relationship between the caring of persons, the caring of communities, and the caring for the environment. So I think that there is a connection between these two advisory opinions, that it's important, and that it's an important contribution by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights.
Thank you very much. We have one final round of maybe 1 minute for final comments. And we have one more question on the Q&A chat, and one is for Judge Gomez. If you are considering municipal law as a reference to principles of international, the question goes, is Judge Marica Gomez implying that the court sort of considered the municipal laws as constituting general principles of law in the sense of Article 38 of the Statute of the ICJ? If you would like to answer that question. And,
no.
No, the answer is no. Thank you.
Quickly, very quickly,
yes,
we are mandated by the American Convention on Human Rights to use the most advanced standards when we interpret the American Convention. And we can collect those standards not only from other treaties or soft law, we can also have a look at domestic law. And the Inter-American Court has done it many times. There are many, many examples of this. And this is how international law is actually shaped, is the connection between what is considered, the opinio juris that you collect internally that gives force to a norm that then translate into international obligation. So you need to look at this material element, this other element, this opinio juris, and you can collect it also from from domestic law, because that's an expression of practice. So therefore, if there are many states in the international community that acknowledge that nature merits protection, and that has some form of legal personality, of course, that somebody else has to exercise on his behalf. But that recognition exists in constitutions, and even at a very small level, in municipalities, in small cities, or cities of different sizes. You cannot ignore it, because it already exists in the legal fabric of our society. So it's from that perspective that the court acknowledges that this exists, that is a good practice, and that is conducive to protecting the environment and mitigating the climate crisis.
Thank you very much for that clarification. And finally, Vivian, Elisa, if you have a final thought that you wanted to express in this conversation. And there are people also watching us from Iceland, from Barbados, and I'm sure that from many other places around the world. Elisa.
Maybe just a personal note. Of course, each tribunal has their own style. What I really appreciated in reading the Inter-American Court is that sense of urgency and maybe a more almost emotional as well as legal reasoning around the topic, the understanding of the depth of the crisis, the holistic understanding. I think the engagement with human rights holders throughout the extensive oral proceedings, to me, there's a lot of life, and that protection of life on our planet that comes across in very vivid ways in the language of the Inter-American Court advisory opinion. And even for that reason alone, although clearly that's not the main or only reason by far, but should be an important reading for everyone in every region of the world.
Thank you, Viviana.
Yes, I would end in encouraging those processes of co-development by different stakeholders. I think that the urgency of the situation and the consequence, the disparate consequences that it has in groups and communities call for that level of understanding and creating solutions together, not in silos. And one point for the Inter-American Court is the court has not done work traditionally in following up advisory opinions and their implementation, but it has done it in court judgments. And maybe with a different format, it could be really a very important convening space, the platform of the court to keep on I don't know, enriching conversations and bringing people together to ensure that we don't have to wait for a case to go to the tribunal to hear more from the court and the capacity that the court has to bring these conversations and make these standards real law at the domestic and international level. And I'm really happy and encouraged by seeing the different special rapporteurs and other spaces of protection internationally building and dialoguing with this with these standards, not in silos, but as Elisa was explaining, trying to bring it to climate negotiations and environmental discussions in high-level fora and also to the affected communities. So thanks a lot for
Thank you very much.
to ASO. This is also part of the important process that we need moving forward.
Thank you very much. And your final words, Judge Gomez, this way.
There is a question in the chat about cross-fertilization between the ICJ and the Inter-American Court. There is a long history of this. There is a long history of an international court like the ICJ, with all the history has, the roots in the Permanent Court of International Justice, addressing issues that are human rights issues, And at some point, we've even seen the same cases, the international court seen them from, death penalty cases, for instance, from the perspective of the Vienna Convention of diplomatic relations and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, having a look at the same cases from the perspective of human rights. That cross-fertilization exists. You can see it in cases. And here, this is in front of us. Viviana said something that I think it was very profound. She said, they've come to us lawyers to fix this problem, and it's complicated because it looks like we have to do it through litigation. We're just doing what we can, but strategic litigation or litigation in general is not really the best way to address this. We're just trying to contribute to shaping practice and opinio juris and rules that are useful for the states of the international community and other actors that nowadays are, even from the economic point of view, even more powerful than states of the international community. So this is a sort of dialogue that we need to have, but the strategies need to be multiple strategies. It's strategic litigation, or what the courts can do through an advisory opinion, is limited. I think it's a happy coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's the work of a lot of people from academia, from civil society, and from states themselves, that we have these 3 advisory opinions, and soon we're going to have advisory opinion from also the African Court of Human Rights. So this is a very important message from the legal community. Let's hope that is a catalyst for what we can do through the rule of law, through international law, to address this issue.
Thank you very much. And just one note on fertilization. Remember, late Judge Cansado Trindade, president of the Inter-American Court, was later a judge of the International Court of Justice. So there was a lot of cross-fertilization with his brilliant mind.
He was not the only one. Patrick Robinson was a commissioner, and then he was also a judge of the International Court of Justice. Yes, in people, but you can see it in cases as well. And
thank you very much. Thank you for the 3 speakers for this interesting conversation. If you thought this was an important conversation, please share this webinar in the ACL YouTube channel. I'm looking forward to seeing you in future events. Thank you very much.